Hello, everybody. Can you hear me if you're still conscious?
We can hear you, Becky.
Yes? Someone respond.
Yeah, we can hear you,
Yeah,
Becky.
all good.
Okay, awesome.
Good.
Sorry. Thank you for your patience. It's actually just like the most meta bit of tech struggle that you've ever seen going on up here. So I want to begin. I want to thank very much the two speakers for today, Dr. Michael Day and Dr. Alke Groppel-Wegener. I've said that right, and apologies if I haven't. Michael's going to start, and I wanted to introduce Michael very briefly by saying that he's an artist, a researcher, a lecturer, and occasional curator. Michael's interested in the ways that digital technologies can structure experience and produce artworks that explore relationships between technology and agency. Michael's practice is interdisciplinary and uses a range of media and technologies, including digital media, sound, installation, electronics, and print. And I'm very grateful that he's stuck it out to this point. So I'm going to hand over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll use that microphone.
Is yours on?
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me on the Teams? Can you hear me on the Teams? And there's no feedback in the room. I mean, there'll be some feedback at the end.
Yes.
Hopefully. Okay, good.
We can hear you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. That was very exciting, wasn't it? Quite a lot of tech drama. So the topic of this seminar is about beginnings and how research topics get started and how research projects kind of get off the ground. So I'm going to talk about a newish body of work. I say new, it's actually a couple of years old, but it hasn't progressed particularly far. And talk about how the end of my PhD study kind of went a bit badly wrong, I suppose, and what I did to turn that around and to move that forward into a new body of work. So my artistic practice and my research, for the most part, is to do with digital media. And towards the end of the PhD, I have progressed the slide, but it might be taking a bit of time to show up on the screen. It's there on the Teams. It's on my screen and it's on the Teams screen. It's just not coming through on this screen yet. So I think it just needs a bit of time to go through. But I'll read out some of the slides anyway, so it will get there eventually, I think. More tech woe for those of you on Teams in the room, sorry. So basically my artistic practice and my research practice are to do with the way that technology creates distraction and captures attention for the most part. And during the PhD, I kind of refined this as an area of study and produced a body of work that kind of explored this area. And towards the end of the PhD, I arrived at what I thought was a fairly succinct description of what it is I was about as a researcher, which is on the slide. You can't see it in the room, but you can see it on Teams, so I will read it out for those in the room. My research is concerned with experiences of distractibility that are said to have emerged alongside the recent widespread adoption of digital communications technologies. Should compulsive engagement with digital media best be seen as information overload, or as a retreat into enjoyable technological distraction? How might the way digital systems are understood as data streams or cloud processes impact on the way we attend to them, or how they algorithmically attend to us? So at the point that I was kind of getting the final bits of work together for the PhD, the final bits of practical work for the PhD, that's kind of what I was working to. I was looking at this idea of how digital media becomes something, particularly social media, becomes something that can be addictive and can create these kinds of compulsion loops. But as the PhD came to a close, still nothing on the screen in the room. I don't know how we can fix that, but
I think you might have to do it on that laptop as well.
yeah, it's showing up on that laptop, but I'll try. Just bear with me a moment, everybody.
There's these two things that you can just,
Yeah, everything's fine. It's just not coming through on.
at the bottom, you can see there's like one of 37. If you click on that one, if you manage to click on that one, it will show up.
So I actually have to do it on this screen.
Yeah, just click, yeah.
Wow.
Makes sense.
And it doesn't work either, so no. That's just showing.
That's just the image of, because on this one it is.
Yeah, on
Yeah,
Teams
okay.
it's working fine. So, yeah, sorry, still trying to fault find.
It's the whole team's concern first. If you look at the top left, the actual timer isn't moving.
Okay. I don't know
Are you
quite
guys
what's doing
still
that.
hearing us out there in Teams world?
I think
Yep.
so.
Yeah, we can still hear you and see everything.
Thanks, everybody.
Sound just
Thanks for your
transformed
patience.
some vision and light for us.
Okay, I'm just gonna.
Speak sounds greater than speaking like that.
I think I'm just going to carry on for those on the Teams. I think it's recording, so it just means that those of you in the room might not be able to see. So I'll perhaps turn that laptop around so you can at least get a glimpse of the slides. Haven't prepared them, you might as well look at them. So as I got to the point where I was concluding the PhD, I found the process of writing up enormously difficult. It was incredibly demanding. It was taking up all of my waking time. I was getting very burnt out and very sort of stressed out. So basically the last year really of the PhD was spent doing nothing but writing. So as a kind of activity, that in itself can be a little bit, just a bit much, frankly. I finally submitted the PhD in August 2018. And usually your Viva is within 6 to 8 weeks after submission for the most part. But for various reasons, my external examiner wasn't in place. And it just dragged on, basically. So I didn't actually complete my Viva until May 2019. That was like an 8-month gap, during which time I was having to try and keep the contents of the PhD as live as I could keep them. In order to be on standby for whenever the Viva was actually called. So this was really hardcore. It was kind of too much for me, frankly. And by the end of it, I was really incredibly burnt out. And once the Viva happened, I did get through it with minor modifications. But those minor modifications consisted of a single sheet of A4, which had a number of bullet points on it. And just one of those bullet points resulted in me having to restructure the whole thesis and add 120 extra pages of documentation. Essentially, because the work I'd been doing was all digital, I'd done an online archive and the external examiner insisted that it was in print. So at that point, after all of that, I was feeling like, well, no matter how hard I work, basically, I'm never going to be good enough for this. I kind of reached the point where I just thought, well, what is this? What am I even doing? But I also, by comparing myself to other people on the PhD program that I was on, found that other people were kind of skipping through it. So I sort of, there were some people who joined and then had a fairly easy time on the PhD and then progressed quite quickly to postdoctoral positions at, other prestigious institutions. So at the end of it all, I kind of felt like I just scraped through it. I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing. I felt very kind of negative about the whole idea and essentially didn't really feel like I was part of academia and didn't feel like I was part of the art world that had sort of supported this. And it's a bit of a sort of common thing to be describing, but I kind of diagnosed this as imposter syndrome. And I wanted to find out a bit more about what imposter syndrome was all about. For my own curiosity, like, is this a thing? Is this a thing that I'm actually experiencing? And so after doing a bit of initial research, I was really looking for something that I could use as a sort of lit review. And I found this great chapter by Maddie Breeze, which is called Imposter Syndrome as a Public Feeling. And when I read this, it was like, yeah, that's me. Basically, feeling like an imposter involves the suspicion that signifies a professional success has somehow been awarded by mistake or achieved through a convincing performance, a kind of deception. Imposter syndrome implies underlying feelings of inadequacy and deficiency, but also conveys a particular felt as inauthentic or fraudulent relationship to belonging and achievement. So having read that, I kind of thought, well, actually, yeah, that's kind of describing how I'm feeling. So reading on, this chapter goes on to discuss who is affected by imposter syndrome. And goes on to discuss how imposter syndrome is distributed in universities and whether it is more common among minorities and those not marked as elite, i.e. non-traditional students and staff, including women, queer academics, black academics, academics of colour, academics with a disability, first generations, working class academics, and academics with caring responsibilities. So the term imposter syndrome emerges from feminist theory in the 1970s, and so being aware that I do have the privilege of being white and male in a largely white male dominated institution of academia, I was wondering whether it's appropriate for me to be sort of diagnosing myself in that way. But on reading this, it became clear that the way we understand imposter syndrome and the way it's experienced is intersectional across a number of different types of social inequality. And there were some there that apply to me. I identify myself as the first generation, the first of my family to have gone to university, as well as coming from a working class background, although it's difficult to kind of claim that if you're working as an academic and, you know, you were once working class perhaps, but yeah, maybe now that's perhaps no longer something that I feel comfortable claiming. But in terms of how this chapter progresses and how it affected me, what I think was important was it allowed me, and it says in the chapter, to rethink imposter syndrome not as an individual deficiency or private problem of faulty self-esteem to be overcome, but instead as a resource for action and a site of agency in contemporary higher education. So this ties into some of the research that I was doing into compulsive use of, for example, betting terminals and social media. If you have a behavioural addiction to a social media system, it's easy to see that as your problem. It's easy to see that as a pathology that you inhabit and you kind of own, rather than looking at the fact that this is a system that's been acutely and carefully engineered to capture your attention and to keep you coming back. So the emphasis in neoliberal HE is to focus on the individual as the site of the pathology, rather than looking at the structural situation that might be causing these things. So all of this was very useful. It enabled me to start to think slightly differently about what I was feeling and thinking, and enabled me to refocus what I was doing in a slightly different area. Towards the end of 2019, I did some what you might describe as imposter syndrome informed teaching. I did a lecture for the students, which was called The End of the Future, which really looked at the collapse of the idea of progress in the 20th century and how even in 2019, it seemed an unusual thought to think that the future would not be as good as the past, whereas I think now, with climate change and with a lot of the other things that are going on with the rise of authoritarian regimes and so on, it seems much more simple to accept that now. But back then, it seemed like something that felt quite wild and quite noteworthy. But as a consequence of that, I started looking at Mark Fisher's work on ontology and thinking about how he describes kind of nostalgia for lost futures. But also in the scope of that research, there's one particular paper called Good for Nothing. It's like a blog post that he wrote about his own depression, where he describes the phenomenon I've just been talking about, this responsibilization, where each individual member of the subordinate class, and he's writing broadly from a kind of class critique perspective, is encouraged into feeling that their poverty, lack of opportunities or unemployment is their fault and their fault alone. Individuals will blame themselves rather than social structures. And also in that he makes this great quote, "The marks of class are designed to be indelible." And that for me had a bearing on how I was thinking about my progression from kind of working class beginnings to perhaps a middle class kind of job and feeling out of place there. So all of this is good learning. And actually at this point, I was starting to think, hang on, I'm doing background research for something here. I don't know yet what that something is, but this is different to what I was doing before. And I'm starting to get a bit of a sense that there's something brewing here. So I started to look at some of the environments that I had grown up in and that I'd experienced as part of my educational experience in the past. And I think any of you can see the slides, but I'll maybe describe them. This is my secondary school, Leadway Comprehensive. That's the quadrangle. This is Salter Lane Art College, which is used to be part of Sheffield Hallam University, and there it is being demolished. And actually, my school's demolished as well, incidentally. And then here we are in Flaxman. We're not in Flaxman now, but obviously here I am at Stoke, and I think Flaxman should be watching its back, bearing in mind my track record of institutions demolished. But reflecting on the spaces, the towns, the locations that I've been in, they all have something in common architecturally. They're made of concrete, they're cheap, system-built, kind of brutalist buildings. There are certain types of concrete decoration which are designed to make them look nice, but actually just make them look slightly more bleak. So I started reflecting on my own background, really, and the place where I was born and brought up. This is the Dee Road estate, which is to the west of Reading, in down south. And this is the whole extent of the estate, which hopefully you can see on screen. It was a very large new build showpiece project that Reading Borough Council put together as part of the slum clearance sort of stuff that was going on in the 1960s. It's not of any particular architectural merit, but it was designed to be a kind of new town development, mostly low rise, with the intention of rehousing people whose houses were compulsorily purchased on the other side of town, and kind of shifting the whole community over. So this is I mean, basically that photo comprises the entirety of my experience as a child. I was not allowed off the estate. We lived kind of near the bottom corner, and actually eventually moved to one of the houses in that vertical street just to the left. But because that was the total range of my experience, it's really deeply embedded, I think, in my interpretation of the world. So I started looking into the backstory of the estate. One of the things about this estate is that it has always been, I think, an area of very high deprivation. It's got a very bad reputation, and I think the council over years, after hyping it up as this showpiece project, to watch it kind of fall from grace quite quickly, I think that the council wanted to go away, basically. There's very little archive material remaining. There's not much research been done on it, not much kind of social history done on it. It's almost like they want this to disappear. So I started making it not disappear. I started, first of all, by looking at some of the contemporary newspaper reports from the time. This is in the run-up to the construction of the estate, shaping a showpiece, Reading's Dee Road estate, advertisement feature note. So this is an advertisement feature that was put in by the construction company in the newspaper. The precinct awakes. The one leg of the new L-shaped precinct has been built. Relentless rain fell week after week. This is building the heroism of the constructors the construction company who built it and put it all together. And then almost immediately it had opened. Literally weeks later, we're having, in the same newspaper, actual journalism. Damp is making children sick, council home unfit to live in, residents shun, vandal hit car parks. So almost immediately, the reality of the situation starts to reveal itself as soon as the advertisement features are all done and dusted. The dream is our nightmare. With its symmetrical blocks, acres of concrete and stark uniformity, the Dee Road estate is an architect's utopia. And that, according to some of the women who live there, is precisely what is wrong with the showpiece estate. And it's true that it was constructed without facilities. There was no bus route running into the estate. There was no post office initially. There was no nursery. So the whole thing was kind of like pushed out really quickly without, I think, being properly infrastructurally set up. And yeah, on we go, the horror that was once council's showpiece. So I think the council and a lot of people in the town actually don't really want this history to be remembered. But a lot of people are fond of the estate and remember their time there. And actually, quite a lot of the low-rise housing was fine and is still standing and works really well. Some of the medium-rise housing didn't last 15 years. It was demolished by the middle of the 80s. So in terms of how this turned into new work, I initially just started drawing and doing very tiny, very detailed drawings of some of the images and some of the texts in the newspapers. And drawing isn't really my thing. I'm very much a software guy. It's like I do digital work for the most part. So drawing was like returning to the past in itself, but also the kind of literal idea of drawing was like drawing near, bringing something closer to you. That felt like an important aspect of this approach. So some of these are ink drawings, some of them are pencil drawings. I'm just going to skim through them very quickly because I'm aware that time's getting on. As I say, I'm not an especially competent drawer, but it did feel like this was an important thing to be doing. And then moving on from the drawings, I'll just kind of zoom in on that one because at the time that was one I really hated. But looking back on it, it feels like it's a bit more expressive than I think I once first thought. But all of these are taken from photographs in the local newspaper, really. They've just been drawn in pencil for the most part. But I also wanted to try and reconstruct parts of the estate and make models of them. So I built this sort of mould to produce some of the decorative end fascias that adorn the ends of some of the concrete blocks. And I was using like paper mache and sort of squishing it in there. And what I had the intention of doing was sort of building a model of the estate using similar methods by using kind of plates of concrete, except it would be papier mâché at a much smaller scale. The estate has this very distinctive design for the concrete plates, which I've not seen anywhere else. So that's something that kind of delineates it as a particular location, let's say. The edges kind of slot into each other in a similar way, not precisely the same as the way that those concrete panels would have done. Some of them didn't work, but those were turning into photographic works as well. So just thinking about those as objects that might express something about collapse or kind of fragility. I also started to build a 3D model of the estate, which is taking ages because I need to learn how to use the software while I'm doing this. So it's taken many months of work to get this far. And anybody who's experienced as a 3D modeler will probably be laughing at this, but I've been doing some very simple architectural sort of visualizations of what it might have looked like when it was new. The tree there is not kind of authentic, but everything else sort of is. But these very flat, very geometric, very modernist compositions sort of reflect something of the ethos of the initial utopian design of the estate before it all started to go a bit pear-shaped. So this is all work in progress, and none of this has been exhibited. None of this has really made it into the public domain yet, except through this talk. So it's been a very slow burn, this project. It's taken an extremely long time to get going. One of the other things I've been thinking about doing is bringing some of the texts from the newspapers into the compositions. Yeah, I'll just very quickly read that one out. Social workers responsible for the area are convinced that facilities are needed which will draw families out of the isolation of their homes to mix with their neighbours. With no pub, church, community centre, dance hall or club, it is difficult to make friends. For the majority, it is life lived in comfortable, if expensive boxes, and that is all. So that's a kind of quite a bleak summary of the situation, perhaps slightly hyperbolically bleak. From the local newspaper, but that's the kind of backdrop to where some of this work has been. So to conclude then, where it's going is a more wide-ranging critique of meritocracy, I think. I think the moment of imposter syndrome and how I got through that was kind of to do with the idea of the failure of the idea that if you work really hard, you'll do really well. And so critiquing that meritocratic view, I think, is quite an important thing to be thinking about. There's a very good book that somebody from the Working Class British Artists Network put on to me, which is called Culture is Bad for You, which is all about working conditions in the art world and in culture industries. And that then leads on to a critique of social mobility through those fields. But in terms of like how you might deploy this approach, if we are to sort of describe this as a method, the takeaway is by satisfying your own curiosity. That's quite a good way to get started, and kind of being self-aware and like critiquing your own feelings of negativity. That can just open the door to something. Maddie Breeze in that chapter speaks about working within and against academia. and I'm extrapolating that into the art world. And I need to know more about that, but that's a feminist strategy about being in a situation but not fully complicit in it and working against it as well as sort of being partially complicit in it. I think she describes it as something in between fight or flight. So you're not fighting it all the way, you're somewhere in the middle and negotiating it. And also, for those who are interested in reducing barriers to participation in research in institutions like this, I think we do need to consider intersecting inequalities and figure out how those barriers can be removed.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Michael.
Sit down.
Yeah, do you want to? Yes. So in this really weird hybrid tech balls up that we've got going on here, it's not a very gender neutral phrase, is it? I think we'll have just a quick bit of time to have a chat with Michael about what he's just shared with us, and I hope that everyone had their own teams going in the room. So I think you saw the images in the room. Hopefully you saw them wherever you guys are. So that's fantastic. So I think first of all, I've got lots of questions, but can we just see if there's anyone either in the room? Oh, Tony has a question.
So one of the things where I come from obviously an engineering background where I think I know what research means, and I've been working with, to some extent, people within sort of more practitioner-based research for a few years now. I still don't pretend to understand how you do it. But one of the questions I always have is, how do you differentiate? I think hopefully this question is useful to other people. How do you differentiate work as purely as an artist versus work that becomes artistic research? Does that make sense? So I can imagine someone could do exactly what you're doing as an artist and present a really good exhibition around it, whereas what you're looking to do is to do that, presumably, but also you're looking at addressing a research question and presenting it as research. So, and to me, there's quite almost a subtle difference between those. So what is the difference, and how do you, as an artist, how do you address that difference?
Let's just check that they heard. Did you guys in Teamsland hear Tony's question?
Yeah, we can hear that fine.
Excellent, thanks.
Thanks. That's a tricky question, and I think each different artist researcher would probably respond to that question differently. For me, one of the things, for me, the art and the art research tend to be fairly interchangeable at times, but the difference, I suppose, is the rigor and the way that the kind of knowledge that's drawn out of it gets disseminated. So at times that knowledge is in the work and is kind of it becomes a sort of knowing in the viewer, if you like. It's almost like the meaning that's created creates an extra layer of knowing in the viewer, and they can understand an idea or an issue differently. You usually need to provide some evidence as a researcher that some knowledge has been created, and usually that happens through writing. So the kind of base level, it's like there's some work and there's some writing, and that turns the work into research. So it's like it kind of explains why and how the work qualifies as research and how that understanding is arrived at. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think the way you presented it, you come across as a researcher in this area, not just as an artist. So, and again, I suppose that's part of it, isn't it? It's how you present. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that would change in terms of context as well. If I was doing an artist talk in a gallery, then that would be different. Some of the rigor in the backstory would still be there, but it wouldn't be as central. It would be more about perhaps the narrative rather than the sort of research aspects, if you like.
I think that's really, we could have the whole rest of the session actually unpacking some of those things, because yes, that fluidity is what makes this way of working so exciting, but also makes it so challenging within the context of an institution that's looking for a more cut and dried answer to the question that you posed, maybe, Tony, in terms of, well, if this is the aspect and this is the research, can we not just sort of separate them out and put them in two different boxes? But that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, no, the two are completely linked. I mean, it's very different to the sort of objective research that you find in the sciences, or indeed in engineering, where if you know, you've made some new knowledge in engineering, if it doesn't break, essentially, you've made a thing and it doesn't collapse. Whereas in art, it's much more qualitative than that, and it requires a lot more interpretive work to draw out the meaning, or to draw out the research. And you need both. You need both the reflection and the interpretation to draw out the research, which again needs to be rigorous. But you need something to actually apply that to. So you need like an artifact in order to make that function.
Right. Have we got anyone else I can go to in the room or in the online world that might have a question or a comment?
Which software do you use for those renders at the end?
That was a question about software for the rendering, because that's a very quiet voice.
That's right. Yeah, I use Blender because it's free, and that was basically. I think I started learning it like years and years and years ago, and got nowhere because like I think I started the first tutorial and it was like first tutorial, and then there's another 200 tutorials to get through. Exactly, no one's got the time for that, but. During the first lockdown, I did have a bit more time on my hands, and so did manage to get through a few more of those. But I'm by no means an expert. It's really rudimentary what I can do with it. But it is important that I do it. I don't want to farm it out and kind of ask other people to do it, although I might get to that point with some of the texturing if it comes to it. But at the moment, I'm kind of interested in the fact that it's me recreating something essentially from old Street View images, because there's hardly any archive material. All there is really is like a moment in like 2012, I think it is, where it's all boarded up, which is on Street View. So you can start to get some of the shape of it. And what I literally did was from those photos on Street View is I kind of measured how many bricks across it was to get a sense of the dimensions of each of the panels, and then built all the panels separately and then start to assemble it in Blender, and then we go really. But I'm not at the point yet where it's turned into animations or anything like that. I don't feel like it needs to be a simulation, although I did try a bit of that. I don't want it to be recreated. I think I just want a record of what it was intended to be. I think that's what feels important about it to me. It's not something that I necessarily even have a huge amount of nostalgia for, but I think I do have nostalgia for the idea, which was to produce a really brilliant place for people to live. It just didn't work out that way. So I'm kind of curious about what that might mean to sort of make a version of that, which isn't based on reality, but then maybe that utopian idea wasn't based on reality either.
I do like your sort of theme of unerasing past. It's really interesting.
Thanks.
I think, again, I'm not unsure if this is question or comment, Michael, it's a bit of both, but I think what's really interesting, or one of the really interesting things you said in relation to this idea of beginnings, is that this project sprang out of a really quite difficult place for you, in relation to your sort of working environment, your own research, and perhaps reflecting on who you are in the institutional space, and that sort of discomfort. And then I think you've gone on to talk about what that feels like from an intersectional perspective, where that sort of insider outsider position, which is really valuable in terms of insight and making and connecting across spaces, but it is actually a really uncomfortable place to sit, isn't it? So I think, I don't know whether you could talk at all about how you now feel when you look back on that kind of imposter syndrome discomfort, having leveraged it into new work. Do you feel differently about it?
I don't think it's cured it.
No.
And I don't think it is curable in that sense. I think it is a thing that's going to stay because people like me don't get PhDs, actually. It's that kind of feeling. So, and I don't think that's ever going to properly go away, despite the fact that there's plenty of evidence there to support the fact that
They do.
They do. So yeah, I don't quite know really about whether it's something that can be fixed, but it is something that can be managed, I think, and managed through strategies. And those strategies are quite sort of, they involve being critical of the system that we're engaging in as academics, but also wider than that in the art world as well, which also has its own problems in terms of privilege and access and those sorts of things. So I think both of those things are important and need to be looked at. How you navigate it as an individual depends on the individual, I think.
Yeah.
And it was brilliant, really interesting, Michael, thank you. I can relate to it very much so in many different ways. Being a white female from the northwest of England is a challenging thing in itself. And I even had a conversation with my husband just this week about the working class background that we're from, but obviously the job that I'm in, also a lecturer. I was just wondering if you're in contact with anyone from the estate, and if you're not, are you planning on getting in touch with them, and could that be a research avenue?
No, except for family. So yeah, I'm not really in touch with any school friends from there. So not really. So yeah, it's only members of family that are kind of there. But in terms of and it is actually quite an important thing to mention this, that I've not been back throughout this whole thing. So this whole research project, I've not gone and actually had a look at the estate or been there. So, and I don't know whether I want to in some ways. I think partly it's about reconstructing it from memory, and there are bits of it that would be simpler if I could go and photograph one of these buildings, but not all of them still exist. So that in itself is difficult. But yeah, I've not been back. There are things taking place on the estate. There's a number of outreach projects there. There's another artist who's doing a project called the Lost Museum, I think, which is again looking at some of these looking at some of the histories of the estate and also trying to build like arts projects there and do something with it. I think it's still quite a deprived area, despite the sort of multiple waves of regeneration that have tried to sort of do something about it. But in many ways, I'm less sort of interested in that side of it. I'm more interested in what it should have been or could have been. It's like, it is quite sort of historical, I think, my interest in it, rather than current. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you.
Especially this feels like this. I don't know if anyone's looked at the Cedric Price exhibition in the Henry Gallery. It always feels like there's an interesting contrast that you are producing or imagining images, say, having not gone back there for so long, of something that was a bit of a disaster, and producing those really, these really nice drawings. And then you look at the Cedric Price exhibition, which was almost the opposite side of it. I was imagining something amazing for the future that never came to fruition. So you've got these sort of two ends of the spectrum of two types of drawings, one about this fantastic new future, and you go back and looking at a hellish past. Yeah, it's more common.
Yeah, I think it is interesting about the, first of all, I don't think it was a hellish past for everybody. I think there were lots of people on the estate who really liked it and stayed there. And in fact, I think my mum probably would have stayed in that house and bought it if she could. But there's lots of, lots of people have stories from the estate that aren't to do with the deprivation and that side of it. But yeah, I think you're right. There were lots of projects that were intended to be utopian, following on from the idea of utopian progress that we inherit from modernism. Some of that still bounces forward into our nostalgia for it. So I'm curious about like how that back and forth bit works. But yeah, you're right. There were lots that were intended, but then never came about. And I wonder whether the ones that were intended to be brilliant and went wrong matter more than the ones that were intended to be brilliant and never happened. It's like whether the absence of that brilliance is kind of allows it to stay live somehow, whereas the presence of something that didn't work out very well has a different effect, maybe. I don't know.
There's also, just very briefly, there's something interesting there about the individual as opposed to sort of designed by the state, which almost is working in opposition to where you were coming from around that kind of aspiration, the neoliberal aspiration of the individual. But the Cedric Price vision was quite particular to who he was and his background and stuff. So I don't know, there's interesting stuff there. Anyway, back to you.
Very briefly, it just made me think about a fashion designer that kind of went down this route of Wayne Hemingway, who was best known for Red or Dead, and he's kind of done this. I don't know if you followed that, but yeah, just a comment, maybe not a question.
I used to love Red or Dead.
Yeah, so did I, yeah. Well, Kate came from a very working class background and then did really well, made a fortune, and then kind of wanted to put back, which was quite interesting.
Great. I think we could keep chatting, but let's move on because Alke's here, and I know that it took us so long to get started. But thank you very much, Michael. That was fascinating. God knows how we're going to make this transition. So if you could just hang in there in the wherever you are in the online world, we'll try and flick this over. Thank you. So you should, if you stop sharing, you could start sharing
Yeah,
and then
we just need to make sure.
speak
that's
into the mic.
within-
But do you want to come over here?
Okay, no, we have no problem.
Okay, guys, so in our multiple laptop, ignoring the thousands and thousands of dollars of technology in the room system that we have going on here, I'd now like to introduce Dr. Alke Gropel-Wegner, who's Associate Professor of Creative Academic Practice here at Staffs, where her teaching focuses animation studies. Alke's research interests are twofold. Within learning and teaching, she explores the links between creative and academic practice, developing a number of visual analogies and creative activities to help students understand hidden academic practice. Alke's other research interest is experience design, with a particular interest in theme parks, from whence she has recently returned, I believe. So
Yeah.
over to you.
That is true. So this is a bit more impromptu than Michael's presentation. I thought I would have lots of time to kind of pull together some great photographs of what I've just done, and I've pulled together some photographs, but you know, so in a way, I think it's a very different topic. And whereas quite a lot of Michael's stuff was monochrome, I'm gonna have some color in my pictures. But so really when I was thinking about when Becky kind of came and kind of said, well, we want something that's about beginnings, I thought it might be really interesting for me to talk about that notion that you need to, when you're doing your research, you need to do something that you're really passionate about, which is why I call it calling your research bliss. There's a picture of the Getty Center, which is one of my happy places in LA, and that was taken 3 weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago. So because I've just come back from a conference / research trip / holiday, managed to combine it all. And I think that's the way to do it, to be honest, right? Find something that you love, and then also find your research tribes. And because it's really helped me to identify the people who are as nerdy about these things as I am, to help me know what I'm thinking about, help me do publications, or, you know, kind of all these things. It is so important. And there's probably, no matter what you're interested in, there's probably people out there who are already talking about it. And these are the people that you need to find. And yeah, so I want to just briefly start with, so my research passion is probably theme park design at the moment. And I stumbled across this through a misunderstanding why I was doing my BA, right? So,
Sorry.
what's going on? There's
Tony
something going on
wants the
there.
slides, so-
Oh, he wants the slides. Can show you. Or I'm still on Teams, so should be able to, you know. Oh, okay. I was studying theater in Germany, and I had this module on dramaturgy, and we were supposed to all have, we were doing Arcadia by Eckburn, I think, and we all had to research one aspect of this play, right? I needed a historical credit. Yeah, don't ask us, like the way the university was organized, very different to this one. And I went to the person who's kind of organizing it and saying, well, I need the historical credit. And he says, well, what you could research is this thing. And he pointed to his list of kind of topics. And what I thought he pointed at was the biography of the playwright. And I said, great, did my research on it, went for the presentation like 2 weeks after, and was shocked to find when he kind of said, oh yeah, now this other person is presenting the biography. And next week, Alke is doing a talk on British garden architecture. I am not interested in British garden architecture. I'm not interested in gardens in any way, shape or form. But I was too embarrassed to admit it, right? So I basically had a week to kind of pull this, you know, out. Did my research, and the one thing that really got me interested was this thought I came across while I was doing my reading, which was, when they were doing this type of garden architecture, they've really designed the experiences for the people who are visiting. They build ruins because they look pretty. And I kind of had that idea, is like, well, that's a bit like Disneyland, isn't it? Never been to a theme park before, certainly not to a Disney theme park, but that was always something I was fascinated with. So this is something that I really loved about this, you know. So I did the presentation, which went well. I wrote it up as a paper, which got a really great mark. And I was like, this is the thing, right? But really, if you hadn't assigned me that thing, or, you know, if I hadn't misunderstood it, I would never have stumbled across this, which, you know, it's like, so you need to be open for things, because sometimes you just come across them. Anyway, I then ended up studying theater design. And after that did a master's, which I did by research. So I picked my own subject and I went back to this, because by that time, while I loved the design of the theater, I was a bit annoyed by the actors, because, you know, 80% of the actors are great, but you have like 10% who are like just a real headache, and I didn't really want to deal with it. So my master's was going to be on what museums can learn from theme park design, and specifically the design of environments. So it's actually quite close to what Michael is sort of in a way talking about, but it's definitely more the escapist spectrum, I guess. But it's, you know, so it had like that educational of the museum and, you know, and the theme park as something. So I really kind of started kind of getting into theme park design. Now after that, I was, I decided to do a PhD. I got funding for a PhD, and the stipulation for the funding was do something that's somehow education related. And at that point, I got distracted and my research branched off away from this passion that I developed about theme parks. Maybe also because I thought it wouldn't be like a proper research kind of like area. I have since then found the confidence to say, no, it totally is. So what I ended up on doing, which is trying to get the next slide up, which is not working. Why isn't it working? It's working here. Is I ended up with something that was about how art and design students are taught to about writing, or how they use writing in undergraduate education in the UK. And this kind of, as I said, it branched off. It kind of another sort of passion developed. It's kind of like, how can I develop activities for students to express hidden creative practice, and a thing that I call tactile academia. It's all about kind of linking creative and academic practice. So that was my PhD on. This is how I got the job here. This is how I got a National Teaching Fellowship. So I was kind of running with that, and it went quite well for quite some time. And at one point, I decided to do this thing for the Higher Education Academy, the fellowship, what's it called, the Professional Standards Framework, HEA Fellowship. And I decided to kind of map everything that I'd been doing and turn it into a quilt. So all these kind of color-coded things are, different things that I'd been writing about, or activities, or, all sorts of things, just to kind of spread out what I'd actually been doing. Because I was at a point where I was like, I need to take stock of what I'm actually doing, but I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. So, I kind of mapped it all out. And what I usually go to is I'll find a creative way of kind of working through that. And then on the other side, I did like this embroidery. Anyway, I didn't have time to bring it in today, but at some point I can bring it in if you're interested. I have this thing because it's an actual artifact. Anyway, what sort of happened is that I found out that, yeah, I still like the kind of tactile academia stuff, but I would also like to go back to this other research, the experience design research. And then luckily I was able to kind of just do that, because I found a new research tribe, right? So what I've just come back from was the 7 Experiences Summit, which is organized by the Experience Research Society, I guess, which is in Utah, which was amazing. If you've never been to Utah, it's awesome. I didn't know that it was that beautiful. But also the people there were kind of just, again, really welcoming and, lovely people. So I would, it's kind of identifying people that come together and kind of talk about the things that you're passionate about is kind of the best thing that can happen to your research, because it always kind of, it's kind of, it kind of gives it a new life in a way, especially if you're kind of just doing something that, you kind of think, oh, is this just me? And if you're doing a PhD at some point, but probably quite a long periods of points, it is just you in a room, and you can start hating yourself, and you can start hating your subject. So it's kind of really cool if you're able to kind of just find people. And I was lucky enough when I was doing my PhD, I came across the Writing Pad project and people who are doing that, and they really helped me out. And ever since then, I kind of, I've kind of been looking out for these kind of research drives. So the Espresso and the 7 Experience Summit is kind of like the latest one of these, which is kind of really, really helpful. And what I'm kind of doing now is I'm kind of linking or trying to link the experience design research with the education research, which is hugely exciting. But really, the rest of this presentation is just an excuse for me to show you what I've been up to over the last 3 weeks. I went to the Warner Brothers studio tour and looked at the way they store their costumes, where I couldn't take any photographs, the way they store their props, the kind of, the like amazing backlog where they film stuff. So and which really makes you think about experiences in a very different way to kind of see how they're organized. It was really interesting how the tour was organized, and those sorts of things, but also what they have is just, they have like really cool shit. I went to the Jim Henson Company and and I teach on animation, so you know some of this is also relevant for my actual work. I got to hold one of the Emmys that Jim Henson got, which was cool. This is actually in the studios where Charlie Chaplin had his first studio. So, you know, very historic kind of stuff. So that was pretty cool. I went to Walt Disney and the studios, hung out with Roy Disney on the bench. I got to meet Floyd Norman, who's on the left there, who's one of the Disney legends. He's one of the first, or maybe, yeah, the first African-American animator that kind of sort of people know of. He worked on the Jungle Book, the original, not the weird new one. Yeah, so I got to chat to him about animation a little bit, which was very cool. I went to the Disney Archives, where you can do research if you're doing that sort of research. You know, they gave me an Oscar to hold. I'm not quite sure why, but this was part of a tour, and they took all these really corny photos. But I thought, you know, I might as well share them with you guys. I went to Disneyland, which is, you know, one of the reasons that I kind of went on this tour, because it gave you some backstage access. So I saw the castle without any other people there, which is pretty cool and hardly ever happens. And also kind of found out how some of the attractions work behind the scenes. And it's, you know, these kind of things are really, yeah. I mean, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that if you research something that you love, then it's not work anymore, right? And I hope that you will all find this. And, you know, some of it is boring, and, you know, getting the data and those sorts of things. But if it always comes back to something that you really love, then this could be a thing. So this is the latest research thing. I've brought also some little sketchbooks that I did on the research trip that I did before, which was to Las Vegas and Orlando, so Walt Disney World this time. I kind of have them here for the people in the, yeah, so the people in the room can have a look at these. And after that, I used the information of that to actually, you know, write and publish a book. So, you know, it's not just like I go off and kind of go on holiday, but it's also, you can actually bring it back because, you know, people are there that talk about these things and they want to know about these things. And experience design is actually something that we need to include more into everything that we're doing. So here's some of the tribes that I at the moment am connected with. So the writing pad is something that still, so writing purposefully in art and design. It's maybe kind of like an old network. I've developed my own little network of the people who came to the workshops that I was giving and that sort of thing. And quite a lot of them I'm still in touch with. There's a symposium that's called The Evolution of Story. That's something that I've recently submitted something to about theme park design and how theme park design has evolved using Star Wars as an example. The Experience Research Society, or Expresso. The College of Extraordinary Experiences was one of those things that kind of helped me get in touch with lots of people, which again is something that's like a very immersive kind of experience. And it totally changed my outlook on teaching and how to do it, which is really kind of interesting. Yeah, and what I'm doing at the moment is I'm trying to make better links between my interest in experience design and my interest in learning and teaching. So at the moment, I'm working on a project on using the hero's journey, which is a storytelling device in learning and teaching, which is what I was presenting at the 7 Experiences Summit. But I really want to kind of develop that more into a framework that could also be potentially become a book. sort of thing. So I think, the point I wanted to make is find something that you're really passionate about and don't ignore these things just because, you think people might not be interested in, or it might be frivolous. And the other thing is, find your research tribes, because these are the people who will support you. These are the people who will let you know about opportunities. These are the people that you can kind of use to bounce ideas back and forth. And especially if you're in the process of doing a project like a PhD, these are the people that will keep you sane. Right. And then thought that would be a nice image at the end, because it's like looking to the future, but also looking to the past. And yeah. Okay. That's me done. You are welcome.
Shunt over just a little bit.
I can do that.
So you can say, I can just join in. Thank you. I'm just having a look.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure. There's another one, this is from a Euro Disney trip. It's kind of only half, but yeah. You want to have a look?
We've got some,
Grab it
we've
for
got
the
some
people out
fans,
there. Yeah.
Euro fans in the room. Does anybody in the room or online have an immediate question? Okay, otherwise I'll obviously, yes,
I'll try to start this time.
thank you.
Has any of your experience research bridged into gameplay research and things like mythology?
Well, only as in saying, yes, games exist, but, I'm not quite, so not in detail, but, that's definitely something that I'm interested in also looking at some point, because, really, yeah, so let's talk.
Yeah.
If, that's something that's relevant, definitely.
So mine's not really a question, but more of a comment. So I somewhat relate to what you're doing in the way, you have to link it to education. So my current PhD is in immersive technology with a link with education. So I've got to think how I can basically connect this to the educational side and write about it, but not lose track of what the original idea is.
Okay.
So what I kind of came up with my supervisor is the fact that education doesn't necessarily link to the learning itself, but also the things that surround education. So he likes to call it like transitional periods. So going in from education, the actual learning itself, and then engagement in different areas. And that's kind of how I was able to narrow down and still keep the original idea with the educational links.
Brilliant.
So it's kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think yeah. And also, if you want to have a conversation, let me know.
Yeah, definitely.
Because
It's a bit daunting side PhD, and then with the educational side, I'm not quite doing a lot. I didn't know what areas to think of, but yeah.
Well, I mean, the way I get around that is I don't think of it as education. I think of it as learning and teaching, which I find easier to. So I think education itself is a discipline very much on its own, and because I'm not, I didn't study that in a way.
I didn't see that either.
Whereas if I'm framing it as learning and teaching, it becomes manageable for me. And maybe that's the imposter, like an imposter syndrome type thing, that, I know people who are within education, at the education with a capital E. And, they seem to kind of know all these things and stuff. And it's like, well, I know stuff, but it feels like what I'm thinking about is in a way more practical. Now that I'm saying this out loud, I'm not sure whether it still makes sense, but so I think my advice for you would be maybe frame it as learning and teaching rather than as education, and you might actually find an easier way in. But I totally agree that actually, we need to be aware that what we can focus on is the teaching and the context, whereas the learning is something that we can't really control because that's up to the individual. And I think we always need to keep that in mind, because we can't really, we can't even.
All the time,
Yeah.
with teaching nowadays.
Yeah.
Like if students not doing the learning, there's only so much you can push them to do.
Exactly, but you can't also prove what they've actually learned. It's really hard to kind of prove that, so.
We can help.
We can.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Yes, this one. I don't really want to give this up. These little books are remarkable, and can I ask a question?
Sure.
About them? So I'm interested to, they are like little artist books or little
Yeah.
sort of aide de memoire artist books. They don't look like. I'm interested to know how that springboards into perhaps more what we might think of as kind of the drier side of research that you might then extrapolate into writing for a book. You know, how do you actually use those? How are they useful to you?
I think it's because they give me the time to think through something, you know, so for me, this isn't easy, right? I want to make something that's beautiful, and it takes me a long time to do it. So, you know, it's not something that I have, and it goes through stages. So, you know, while I was away, I took field notes of the new trip and I took photographs, and now the planning stages begin for the next part of the book. And, you know, I'm really thinking about, you know, what are the important things. So it helps me deprioritize, and yes, it becomes an aide memoire, but also it's kind of, you know, planning it and layouting it and then drawing it and painting it, you know, allows me that time to think about what have I actually experienced, what does that mean, and analyze it. And one of the things within the whole of, you know, this tactile academia approach that I have to teaching is also it's really helpful to give your hand something to do so that your brain can catch up with your thoughts. And so in a way, this is one of the ways that I enforce that for myself.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a really nice process.
Yeah.
Do you apply this methodology in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I try as much as possible. So this morning we had, like, in here, I mean, I gave the students, you know, things to cut up and, you know, that sort of thing. And then my second years were drawing fish, which were like identifying whether they're finding good sources in the library. So yeah, yes, I do. Cool. I am. When I can, you know, you can't always, but, you know, when I find something where that's relevant, then yeah, definitely, because I think that's what we need to do. Sometimes students kind of think I'm like going back to kindergarten because I make them do things like draw fish. But it's like, it's not about the fish, it's about thinking about the sources, and the fish is just a metaphor, for example. So other stuff.
Because it's theory, isn't it, that you teach, you're not in the studio, is that right?
Yeah. Because I'm not an animator.
I love that idea though, because you're saying going back to kindergarten, it's really interesting. We do that in fashion as well, trying to get away from, as we get a little bit older, we kind of put barriers, don't we? We're afraid of things, so we're going back to getting to do things. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it helps them figure it out for themselves rather than this, you know, very often students come in and, you know, they've been trained at school to just memorize things and, you know, maybe find pieces of information, but, you know, the whole analytical skills, you know, we need to reteach them how to do that. And I think working creatively is a very good way into that, especially for people who identify as creatives by the course that they kind of pick.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting and about lots of interesting things about what you've shared with us, but I think this idea that you know, you describe it as your research bliss, and the idea that you could sort of fall in love with your research territory and kind of hold on to that affection for it through what is a really arduous process, you know, like Michael's described. But you did it in its, you know, by sort of circuitous routes and a little bit of happenstance in a way. But I wonder how much, and you've spoken of it quite lightly in this room, but I wonder, have you had to really argue for your territory to be taken seriously?
I mean, so when it comes to the tactile academia stuff,
I'm more thinking about the experience design.
yeah. So with the experience design, usually because I found my tribes, I present and work with people who totally agree this is a thing, right? So I don't usually go to conferences where they don't know what experience design is. But we are now having experience design as a sector has the same issues that kind of art and design has had, like 20 years ago, and it's still ongoing. It's kind of like, who are we as a discipline? And I'm really trying to kind of make people see that we shouldn't just be a science. We should also be an art and a humanity discipline. So it's that really exciting time where really the discipline doesn't quite know what it is yet, and we have so many opportunities to do that, right? But I think it's related as an issue that people kind of tend to go back to the paradigm that they know, and it's like, well, this is what a scientific paper looks like, so an experience design dissemination needs to be like that. And I'm like, no, there's other genre we can use which might make more sense. And but I mean, it always gets kind of pushed back. So one of the most recent kind of chapters I submitted initially was meant to be an article, but it's written as a choose your own adventure. And oh my God, we had so much pushback. And the journal wouldn't publish it. And it now goes into a collection, because the editors are kind of more open. But that idea that, well, it doesn't have a method section. It's like, well, that's not what it's about. It's about going, trying to write something. It's about collaboration in higher education. And, it's kind of trying to simulate something that through your choices and through some, randomization, you almost feel the frustration, or you feel the elation and, of what could happen. But yeah, just people kind of say, well, you can't do that. It's like, well, actually, we're going to. And yeah, so it is kind of, there's so many traditions that I think experience design has the opportunity, if we as a discipline assert ourselves and kind of say, well, actually, we want to do it in a different way, we could, but we will then have the problem of kind of people questioning whether we actually are an academic discipline.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I think we should need to push through that.
Do it anyway. Absolutely.
Yeah. So because I present that work in the context of people who are already kind of open to that work, I haven't had any pushback. When it comes to creative stuff within academia, I've had people questioning the rigor and stuff, and I've done quantitative. I mean, still relatively small scale, but quantitative projects that kind of actually, well, we can prove that this works. I mean, I've done one of them, and that's enough for me to prove it.
Yeah, we can tick your box.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I can always go back to them.
Yeah, I think there's just there's the need for so much less rigidity in approach and measure in the measuring tools that currently exist. I think that's the reality, but it's really great to see. I think we've had two really wonderful examples of ways that research and practice and making and generative experiences are completely holistic. Actually, they're completely holistic, three-dimensional expressions of people's lives and interests, and actually institutions need to become much more, just much smarter about how they, you know, with the capacity that they have to value those outputs, I would say. That's my thing. Right. Look, thank you. Sorry, has anyone else got any questions? Not, I shouldn't want to end up on me. Whoops, sorry. Come on. Anyone still out there? Hello, hello, no. Great. Okay, look, thank you so much. I'm really, you know, next month I will have this down. You guys will come and it will be slick and you'll be really pissed off that it was awful for you. So I will sort it out. But thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you to both of you. Thanks to everyone that was here. Thanks to everyone that was online. If they're not now, thank you anyway.
Thanks.
And we're out.
You're welcome.
Thanks, guys.
Me-
Is it you or me?
I
Who
think
knows?
this.
I've lost track of who's even doing it now.
I'm gonna-